Can I welcome everyone to the 16th meeting of the Public Audit Committee for 2013. I have apologies from Bob Doris, and I believe that Christine McKelvey will be joining us shortly. Can just make sure that everyone has electronic devices switched off. Thank you. Item 1 on the agenda, can we agree to take items 4 and 5 in private? Agreed. Thank you. Item 2, we have a Section 23 report from the Auditor-General and Audit Scotland, and it's on Scotland's public sector workforce. I welcome the Auditor-General and her staff with her, and can I invite you to brief the committee? Thank you.
Our 2011 report, Scotland's Public Finances Addressing the Challenges, highlighted that reducing the public sector workforce is the main way in which the costs of public services will be reduced in the face of the continuing financial challenges they face. This report on Scotland's public sector workforce was published on 28th of November, and it examines how councils, the NHS, Scottish Government and other central government bodies have changed their workforces since 2009. It also looks at the savings bodies have made from these changes, what plans they've got for the future, and what they'll need to do to achieve the savings and the other reforms required over that period. Over the 4 years since 2009, councils, the NHS, the Scottish Government and the other central government bodies have reduced their workforces by 26,600 whole-time equivalent posts. The extent of these changes, though, varies across the different sectors, from a 1% reduction in the NHS, which is equivalent to about 1,400 whole-time equivalent posts, to a 10% reduction in council staff, almost 24,000 whole-time equivalents. We estimate that these changes reduced the costs of staff by about £1 billion over the 3 years from 2009-10 to 2011-12. Around a third of that reduction in staff numbers and costs was due to transferring staff and services out of the public sector to arm's-length bodies and other non-public sector bodies. We estimate that transfers to arm's-length bodies accounted for almost 10,000 of the 26,600 posts removed. It's worth noting, however, that the public sector pays annual service fees to these bodies for the services they provide, so it continues to contribute to the staff costs that they incur. Our estimate of a £1 billion reduction in staff costs doesn't take account of these payments. Part 2 of the report looks at how bodies implemented changes to their workforces. Exhibit 7 on page 24 of the report shows the main approaches used by 80 public bodies between 2009 and 2013. All of them used pay restraint, and most assessed vacancies as they arose, only filling the posts that they saw as business critical. The majority also used staff redeployment. 69 bodies, including all 32 councils, used early departure schemes, and 62 bodies used early retirement schemes. Staff leaving through those means vacated around 16,000 whole-time equivalent posts. And the committee will recall that I briefed them on our report managing early departures from the Scottish public sector before the summer recess. By using a mix of approaches, the 9 public bodies that we reviewed in detail had made the workforce changes they needed to meet their short-term business and financial objectives. We have made some recommendations in our report that bodies should improve how they do this in future by planning strategically and using the good practice that we identify. We also recommend that they should collect information on the costs and savings associated with their workforce change programmes and the impact of those changes on services and staff well-being. In Part 3 of the report, we look to the future. Public sector finances will continue to be under pressure for the foreseeable future due to budget constraints, demographic change and increasing staff costs. When we conducted our fieldwork in April and May of this year, not all bodies were able to forecast their workforce numbers and costs for 2014-15. Those who could estimated that overall workforces would continue to reduce by over 3,000 whole-time equivalents, and at the same time they were forecasting that staff costs would rise by £209 million up to 2014-15. The forecast rise in costs is due to a combination of factors, including pay increases, pay progression, the implementation of the Scottish Government's commitment to a living wage, and bodies settling equal pay claims. To meet these financial challenges and reform public services, public bodies need to extend and strengthen their workforce planning. We list some of the options open to them in the report, and we also recommend that they need to think differently about how they will deliver services by prioritising and redesigning services and by increasing joint working across organisations and sectors. Convener, as always, my colleagues and I are happy to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you very much. A couple of questions I have to start. You say in your key messages on page 9.5 that the Scottish Government has a number of reforms underway that could help deliver some of the change needed. Could you maybe describe some of those reforms?
Certainly, Convener. Just to pick a couple out initially, health and social care integration is intended, first of all, to deliver better services, particularly to older people, but to people in general in the community through closer joint working. But we think they also have the potential to manage the cost pressures by looking at the way staff work together and also by looking at new types of roles that break down some of the boundaries between different professional disciplines or between the work that staff can carry out at the moment, depending on whether they're employed by NHS or council bodies. That's one example. We're seeing similar initiatives in relation to early years and increasingly, I think, actually in the criminal justice system in relation to reoffending, where we're seeing the barriers between the prison service and community justice work being broken down.
The examples that you gave there, have the potential savings been costed and quantified?
That's not some work that we've done at this stage, although we have got some work coming out on reshaping care for older people in the new year. We do think it's one of the reasons why the workforce planning we're talking about in this report is so important, though. Each of the bodies involved in those sorts of processes of reforming services and working more collaboratively in future need to understand what staff they have, what roles they carry out, the pressures they've got in terms of an ageing workforce or recruitment challenges as a basis for thinking about making better use of their staff jointly and redesigning jobs to make sure they can work more effectively and efficiently in future.
Okay, thank you. On page 12, paragraph 19, you say that 18 NHS and central government bodies increased their staff numbers. Would you be able to give us a note, not necessarily today, of the bodies which increased their staff numbers?
Within the limits of the data we've been able to collect, certainly. We say more generally in the report that there are differences between the sectors and that all of the bodies have been recruiting staff to replace essential posts who've left or to reshape their workforces in planned ways. Fraser, do you want to add some detail to that?
Just to say, I was just checking with the team convener so we can provide you with that information. That's fine, yeah.
Is the balance more on NHS bodies or is it more on central government bodies?
9 central government bodies who had increased their numbers and 9 health board.
So at a time when, for example, direct services provided by local government are being squeezed and staff numbers are going down, we've got 9 central government bodies which have increased their staff numbers. It'd be interesting to see that. Thank you. Just 2 further brief questions. Equal pay claims. Are you able to quantify the potential size of those claims? Because I know that those which have been reported so far have sizable implications for the local authorities concerned, but is there an overall figure?
We have looked at in relation to both local government and the NHS and have reported the best estimates available in the Local Government Overview Report and the NHS Financial Performance Report. I'll ask Fraser and Angela, if I may, to pick up the questions for each of those sectors. Fraser, as Controller of Audit, responsible for reporting on local government to the Accounts Commission.
I'm afraid I can't recall the number off the top of my head, convener, and we can confirm that for you, but also to confirm that when we do the local government overview report, which we'll be publishing I think in March of next year for the financial year just ended, that will be something that we'll be updating again about the total amount of money that councils have put aside for, so how much does it cost to date and how much more have they put aside for that. So I can come back to you on last year's number and we'll be updating that again this year.
Is it correct to say that the figure will be a sizable one that could have a significant impact on local government services?
It'll certainly be a sizable one. The extent to which it will have impact on services, I think, is a different question. But yes, it's a pretty big number, and as you know, as the Commission, the Accounts Commission, will be very happy, as usual, to brief the committee on the overview report. We'll be in a position to say how much councils have set aside for the future potential claims.
My last question relates to the ALIOs, and I might come back to the ALIOs later, but once services are transferred to ALIOs, you say that there are still financial implications where local authorities have to make service payments to the arm's length bodies. Is there any scrutiny by the Accounts Commission of those arm's length bodies in the same way that there would be of local government?
I'll ask Fraser to pick that question up.
Thank you, Convener. The simple question is it's not the same, and the reason it's not the same is that councils are directly audited by the Accounts Commission under the 1973 Local Government Scotland Act. To some extent, the whole point of arm's length external organisations is that they become different kinds of organisations, whether they're charities, companies limited by guarantee, a whole range of different kinds. The interest of the Accounts Commission is in following the public pound. So the Commission's interest and Audit Scotland's interest is ensuring that councils have strong governance arrangements in place to ensure that they have oversight of how the public money that they're giving to ALIOs is being spent and being delivered. I think you might be aware that the Accounts Commission has been doing quite a lot of work and a lot of thinking over the last 6 months about this very subject. We've had several papers to them this year, and we're continuing to keep a very close eye on that very topic. In fact, we've asked all 32 council auditors in this current audit year just kicked off to really go and do some more due diligence work, if you like, on the position around ALIOs. So how many have they got, what are they like, how much do they spend, what are the governance arrangements like in councils, really to try and get as up-to-date a picture as we possibly can.
It was really just on that point. I note from the summary page on page 4, the staff left through early departure 15,800, which was 4%. Excuse me, but 3% are transferred to ALIOs or other bodies. And then further over, I noticed there's quite a degree of private sector there. For example, in paragraph 22, Forth Valley transferred 541 facilities management jobs to Serco, and Highlands Islands Enterprise 23 jobs to Atos. Now, these are private sector companies. If I can go back to what the convener said, A, do you have a breakdown between how many ALIOs, third sector, private sector, and B, how do you provide some sort of accountability and governance for these jobs when it is a complete private sector company, as we have examples here?
You're absolutely right. What we've focused on in this report is staff who have transferred from being public sector employees to being the employees of either arm's length organisations or private companies. About 10,000 of the 26,500 reduction are staff who fall into that category, so it's a significant amount. By far the bulk of those are staff who transferred to arm's length organisations rather than public companies. We've got around 600, I think, in total in the 2 examples we quote here in the report. The same principle, I think, applies to transfers to private companies as does to arm's length organisations, as Fraser was just outlining. And particularly in there, the importance of being able to follow the public pound, make sure that the money that's being used to pay for those services is being managed properly, accounted for properly, and is providing the service that's intended. And I think there is a growing interest that we're all aware of in the terms and conditions that affect staff who are subject to those transfers. We haven't looked at this directly in this piece of work, but it's something we're very conscious of and will be keeping under review as we plan on audit work in future.
So given the transfers from the public sector to Atos and Serco, would you expect from the work that you've done, is this an intention for future to give public sector work not just to ALIOs but to private sector companies?
We're seeing the examples we found are isolated examples. I think it is worth distinguishing these transfers of people from areas where services are being commissioned as a matter of policy from private sector organisations. Again, that's less widespread in Scotland than it is under UK government policy for very deliberate policy reasons. But I think, again, where those sorts of large contracts are in place, they do throw up particular issues, both about employment, as your question is highlighting, but also more generally about accountability for public money. And it's something that we are focusing on in planning our future audit work to make sure we've got proper oversight of where those big contracts are and that we understand the risks associated with them for the good stewardship of public money.
And my second question, Convener, is Exhibit 7 on page 24. I know vacancy management is used widely in the NHS. I hadn't appreciated just how widely used it was across Scotland to manage the workforce. 32% NHS, 32% councils, 21 NHS and 24% in the Scottish Government. I hadn't realised it was the second top next to pay freezes. Can I just ask, I understand vacancy management, the longer you keep a job open, the more you're saving money. But in terms of effective spend, are there concerns there that the use of vacancy management can impact on service delivery when it's second top of the league here?
I think that's why we're highlighting the range of mechanisms used and that particularly as being one that's very commonly used. The advantage, obviously, and the attraction for public bodies is that it's quite straightforward to implement. If somebody leaves, then you can hold that post until you're either sure that it needs to be filled because it's business critical or can think of another way of filling that need. The risk is, first of all, that you leave a gap in that role, but also that it's not a strategic view across the service or across the organisation of really where your priorities are and can limit the options for looking at more flexible ways of filling the gap that the person has left behind them. So it's entirely understandable that public bodies are using vacancy freezes as a way of managing their budgets, and we've done the same ourselves in Audit Scotland, but it's not a substitute for strategic workforce planning over the longer term.
I was thinking about specialist consultants. I would think in that case there have been concerns. And my third and final point, Convener, when I got to paragraph, put my specs on, when I got to paragraph 101 last night, I didn't quite understand what you meant in the last sentence. It's really about the Scottish Government. Well, I know the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill is just starting its way through this Parliament. But what is meant by including whether communities could help provide services directly? I didn't quite understand that in my own mind. I represent the Highlands and Islands, and I'm just thinking how local communities would provide services. Could you perhaps explain what's meant there by communities providing services?
I think it is very closely allied to the concept of community empowerment, of working with communities about what services matter to them, and then thinking, depending on the characteristics of that particular place, the people who live there, the problems that exist, what's the best way of addressing them. We're certainly not suggesting that public services should be removed, but we are saying that there may be good ways of, for example, encouraging people who live in a small remote community to look out for older people themselves and to be able to call in professionals when they're needed, to think about the way in which services that are important in terms of community cohesion can be encouraged by the statutory sector but delivered by people who live there. I think Fraser may be able to add to that based on our experience of community planning audits over the last year.
And there are, I think, lots of good examples, Mrs Scanlon, where this happens. I remember from previous work in Orkney, communities did things like maintained the local cemeteries, monitored coastal erosion. So there are lots of good examples of this kind of thing, even in my own, taking my professional hat off for a minute, where I live in Haddington, we've got a new football pitch and I'm involved in my son's football team, and that's entirely community run. In previous years, that facility almost certainly would have been run by the council. So I think there are examples of this happening, and I think the Community Empowerment Renewal Bill would be designed to encourage that. Now, that raises all sorts of interesting questions in the same way as we've just had the discussion around ALIOs, about accountability and how does the funding for that work and all those kinds of things that certainly we're very interested in. But it's that kind of thing where communities aren't just being consulted on things but are actually being involved in the design and delivery of public services more directly.
Okay, leave it there.
Thank you. Before I go to Colin Beattie, can I welcome Christina McKelvey to the meeting and ask Christina, do you have any interest to declare?
No, I don't have any interest to declare in relation to this committee, but I would refer members to my register of interest, and please accept my apologies for my lateness this morning.
No problem. Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. As the Convener originally picked up here, this question of transfers to ALIO are quite significant. And I remember that I think it was Audit Scotland that did a report a couple of years ago on ALIOs, which was quite a useful one. Now, I think from what you were saying, you're going to perhaps work into your audit programme maybe a follow-up to that to have a look at what's happening with the ALIOs. Would that be correct?
Not specifically that, Mr Beattie. I think what we did, as you say, a couple of years ago now, did in a sense, it was a good practice guide that if you are going to be doing ALIOs, this is how you should go about it. Even since then, we've seen more ALIOs being created, and interestingly, a shift towards more ALIOs being created for more personal services type services. You know, there's a new local authority trading company in Aberdeen, for example, that's now delivering care services. So for a while there, it tended to be kind of leisure services that were being transferred into ALIOs. We're now seeing that model being delivered more widely. So the Accounts Commission in particular, and Audit Scotland on their behalf, therefore have a real interest that if that's a pattern that's going to continue with local government services being delivered through these different kinds of organisations, what does that mean for our ability to scrutinise those? So that's the work we've been doing this year, really, to take stock and to say, to ask ourselves the question, for example, does the Accounts Commission need any more powers? Now we're pretty confident that we don't need any more powers at the moment. We think there are powers that we already have that allow us to follow the public pound and to get assurance on how that money is being spent. So I think rather than it necessarily being a separate bit of follow-up work, as I say, first of all, we have asked local auditors to really give us a very good and robust baseline about the picture as it currently stands in local government, and then that will inform whether we do anything more. But I do think it's going to be an increasing feature of our audit work, inevitably, because that's how services are being delivered.
Certainly my opinion is that you touched on a very important point, which is following the public pound, and if increasingly the public funds are being spent in ALIOs, there should be some way to follow that up and audit it and look at the governance of these organisations.
It's the wee case study we have in this report about South Lanarkshire, which is on page 13, we've just used as a wee example of the kind of thing that we're talking about. And they're quite significant amounts of money in South Lanarkshire. That's £21 million going into the Leisure Trust every year. So you're absolutely right, following the public pound principle is hugely important there. It is worth saying, I guess, also that it's not a completely barren field in terms of accountability. If it's a charity, they will be regulated by Oscar, for example, and all of these bodies will appoint their own auditors and their financial statements will be audited every year. The question specifically for us is how do we, as the public audit organisation, ensure that the public accountability for those funds is maintained and assured.
Would there not be a different approach, though, from an auditor appointed to, say, a charitable body who's really looking at the, you know, have the funds been properly accounted for and so on, as opposed to the public audit, where we're looking at a rather wider sense of how the funds are used and effectiveness?
That's absolutely right. So in local government terms, it would be around the whole notion of best value, that the appointed auditors of those ALIOs won't be doing best value audits, for example. Their job will be to audit the financial statements. So that's the kind of thing that we are thinking very hard about, is how can we use our powers around best value via the council to get assurance that the way in which these bodies are being governed and operated is sound.
When will you actually finish the assessment that you're doing?
The work that the auditors are doing, they're doing as part of this year's audit, so we should begin to see that coming through certainly no later than this time next year, but hopefully we'll see the results of that earlier, depending on when exactly they do the work. So I would hope by the time we get to this point next year, we'll have a clear sense of what else we might do about it.
A long way away. I'm just looking at some of the other comments made here. For example, in paragraphs 34, 35, 38, there's reference, not for the first time, to lack of information or information not being available. And I wondered the extent to which this has impacted on the information contained in this report, how good an indication the information here is, given the limitations of what you've been able to access.
It's the best information that the team has been able to gather, but you're right, there are both gaps and inconsistencies between different bodies and different sectors. I'll ask Angela, if I may, to talk you through what the picture looks like overall, how we've compensated for gaps, and what the most important gaps that we think need to be filled are.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, as Caroline said, it's the best available data that we have. The cost information we have taken from a range of areas, largely the annual accounts in some sectors, in health and central government, for example. But in local government, local authority accounts don't highlight separately staff costs, so we have used the local financial returns in the local government sector to capture that information. Again, that's the best information that's available. It's not perfect, but it's the best that's available. So we've tried to fill those gaps. The part of the methodology for the audit was also to capture information from 80 survey bodies. So we actually surveyed all of the health boards, all of the councils and 26 of the largest central government bodies to provide us with further information to supplement what we already knew from their annual accounts, and also the staff numbers. We used lots of official statistics for those, so ONS data, the data on workforce statistics that the NHS publishes through ISD. So we used a lot of that information and then tried to fill the gaps by doing an additional survey.
If I ask you what sort of error factors in this, I'm trying to get a grip myself as to, you know, we've got lots of statistics here, lots of figures, and they do give us a good indication as to what's happening. But what is there any error factor in that?
I suspect we haven't calculated an error factor specifically, but we've covered all of the main bodies, all the health and local government bodies, and the largest central government ones. So there'll be a larger number of small bodies that won't have a big impact on the overall picture you've got. I think the real challenge probably is the one we've focused on in questioning so far, which is the impact of staff who are transferred out of the formal public sector but are still being funded by the public sector in different ways, and understanding what that means in terms of both the level of service provided and the value for money is not easy to do with the information that's readily available here. As Fraser said, there are ways we can compensate for that in particular pieces of work, but it does mean a real drill down with a very clear focus of what it is we're trying to achieve. We think this does give a good and reliable high-level picture, but there are gaps in areas like that that are difficult to pull together.
Just one last question, which is on paragraph 91, where you highlight the fact that staff costs are likely to increase, and you're estimating a £433 million increase. This, of course, as you say, is assuming that there's no action taken by any of these bodies. If things stay static, which I assume is unlikely, 433 million, that's a lot of money. Do you think that, do these organisations that you've audited, are you satisfied they've got plans in place to address that?
We think that there are two levels at which that operates. First of all, just looking ahead 1 year to 2014-15, not all of the survey bodies that we looked at were able to give us that information for 14-15. I think about a quarter were unable to. So even in that short period, some bodies aren't where they need to be in terms of forward financial planning. More significantly, in many ways, I think the longer look ahead towards, say, 2020, given what we know about the likely financial climate that all public services will continue to work in over that period, and the pressures that we know are coming, we think it's critical that each organisation has its own strategic workforce plan that gives them that picture, and that's pulled together by sector and where public bodies are looking to work together to reform public services and meet the challenges. And not all of them have that strategic workforce plan in place for the organisation outside the NHS, which stands out as a real example of good practice for that. Did
you get the impression that there was an awareness of the problem?
Fraser, Angela, would you like to answer that as being closer to it? Angela?
Yeah, I mean, Caroline's absolutely right. There's lots of workforce planning activity going on, and we do highlight a lot of that in part 2. All of the bodies that we looked at had done workforce planning at a service and departmental level. They hadn't necessarily pulled that together into an organisation-wide workforce plan, which we would like to see them do, and they have. We've made that recommendation to them. But they had, through the workforce planning that they were doing, they had started to think about the current staffing that they had and what they might need for the future and what gaps there were in the skills mix that they had started to try and address that. And we've highlighted a couple of examples in the report where they have started to do that. Caroline's absolutely right, though, that from the survey that we did, 58 of the 80 bodies were able to provide information for next year, 14-15 at the time we did the audit. And there was an awareness that for the others that it was something that they had to do, they just hadn't done it yet. So we are encouraging them to do that, and we're making a recommendation that for staff numbers and costs that there's a rolling 3-year forecasting going on, so that bodies are very aware of what staff numbers they need and the associated costs, at least in the short to medium term, and use that to build their longer term workforce plans.
I think overall we probably say that most bodies have been focused on the short term, on being opportunistic and taking advantage of opportunities as they've arisen, and that has managed in the short term, but it's not enough for the longer term, and it does run the risk of short-term choices being made that might make the challenges more difficult for the longer term, and it's that shift we'd like to see coming through.
Before I bring in James Dorman, can I ask on the point which Colin Beattie raised there on page 36 about staff costs increasing. You say at Exhibit 11 for councils and NHS, you show the staff costs of 2012-13 and then talk about the percentage increase due to pay progression, which is an annual increment that some staff are entitled to. Then inflation, and both for the council 2.26% and for the NHS 2.02%. These figures are higher than what has been published in terms of the pay agreement. So where do the figures come from?
I'll ask Andrew to talk you through the detail. These are averages for sectors, so there's a lot of variation within them. Andrew.
Yes, indeed. Sorry, the figures came from the survey work, and individual bodies were asked to just tell us what they were factoring in terms of budgets going forward for each of these different elements. So it's their own estimates taken at the earlier part of this financial year, and we've averaged across all the bodies to give these figures for the sectors.
Is it not the case that for councils and NHS that pay increase has been limited to 1%?
Been. These figures are looking ahead to what people expect to be doing in the period up to 2014-15, and there are different members will be aware that there are different elements to the overall growth in the pay bill. There's pay progression upscales, there's the inflation element, which has been awarded by some councils but not others, and then particular changes made to particular staff groups, which are averaged for each sector and come to the overall figure we give for Scottish Public Services as a whole.
James Dorman.
Thank you, Convener. Sorry, but I'm going to have to take you back to the Aloes thing. Fraser, you were talking about you didn't see the need at present for further powers to follow the public pound spend. Now, there's at least one example in Glasgow of an ALIO which has had frequent losses. It's not been a one-off loss. In a situation like that, are you confident you know how that came about and have the ability to take lessons from that can be used by that council and other councils, and how to deal with ALIOs?
Yes, I am, Mr. Dornan. I think we can do that at the moment. I think our starting point is that councils are allowed to create ALIOs, and some of them are doing that in a sense as auditors. That's our starting position. The report that Mr. Beattie mentioned that we published a couple of years ago was saying if you're going to do it, this is how you should set it up, this is how you should run it, and this is how you should maintain it. And so that's our starting point. I guess, as I say, it's something that we in the Accounts Commission are keeping very closely under review. And as I say, at the moment, our judgment is that there's still plenty we can do, and indeed probably more that we can do with existing powers to look at exactly the kind of examples you've just mentioned. As I say, I would also say that there are occasions, and there was one such occasion in Glasgow, where other regulators, and Oscar in particular, have a very strong locus in some of this as well. So we need to make sure that the different regulatory regimes are working well together, and particularly in the case of it being a charity. If it's a charity, that charity and Oscar will be very keen to ensure that the trustees are acting independently, and we have an interest in ensuring that the council is governing it well. Those two things are not necessarily easily aligned, and that's work that we are progressing with Oscar. So it's not straightforward. I guess what I was saying, that at the moment our view is that there are sufficient powers for us to do what we think needs done, but it's something that we're keeping under review.
I'm delighted to hear that you think you've got a handle on it, because when I was a councillor in Glasgow, I found it very difficult to find out how the money was getting spent, and that there was best value for it. Also on paragraph 34 on page 17, which was talked about earlier on, you say we do not have equivalent information for councils or other central government bodies. Is there a problem with councils in terms of being able to gather the information that you require? Are some deliberately obstructive, or is it just that they can't get round to doing it, or are the systems not in place to make information easily available to you?
I don't think we're saying there's a problem with council systems. I think it goes back to the point that Angela was answering earlier, that the way information is collected is different in different types of public body and different sectors. In the central government, there are specific statistics which cover administrative grades and other types of civil servants. Figures are collected differently for local government, and therefore that comparison isn't straightforward to draw at all. We do think there's a case for better information in general, as the focus on the way in which savings are being achieved is increasing, and the need to maintain services in the face of growing demands is very present, as we know. But that's not a criticism, it's simply a reflection of the fact they're collected differently just now.
So do you think there's a case then for a kind of uniformity of the way that data is collected?
I'd put it slightly differently. Clearly, we're not looking to collect information for its own sake. There's a cost to that, and we're not looking to sort of fulfil that traditional bean counter stereotype. I do think there's an argument for more transparency, particularly at a time when people are having to make tough choices about the way public money is spent. Having more information about staff numbers, what staff are doing, helps people to understand what the impact of those choices is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Willie Coffey.
Sorry, I've heard you there. Thanks, Hugh. Just briefly continuing the ALIO theme for a moment there. Of course, when staff are transferred and services are transferred to the ALIOs, the local council, in effect, has no control over prices, for example, that the public may be charged for typically leisure services that form quite a bulk of the ALIOs. The accountability for that presumably rests, therefore, with the ALIO board in terms of the public making representation about that kind of issue. But on the flip side of what James Donnan was talking about there, should some of Leisure Trust, for example, ALIOs, break even or even make profits, where would that profit go back to? Would it come back to the council, or would there just be readjustments in subsequent years by councils in terms of funding the ALIOs, do you think? How does that work?
It will almost certainly depend on how it's been set up in the first place, Mr Coffey. I think most, in fact all councils will be agreeing whatever you want to call it, a terms of reference or a service level agreement or whatever it is with the ALIO that they're setting up, and that kind of thing will be factored in. I would certainly expect if there was any profit, in inverted commas, to be made, it would be reinvested back in the service, is how that would work. And you're right, that it would be the responsibility of the board of that ALIO, in the case of a leisure trust, to make those kind of decisions. In a sense, that's the point of making it an ALIO. The whole point of putting it at arm's length on things like that, and certainly boards of leisure trusts that I've spoken to are very clear that one of the benefits of that is that depending on where you are in the country, your competition is not other local authority services, your competition are private sector health and fitness companies. So they would argue, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. They would argue that the whole process of putting them at arm's length allows them to be a bit more commercial, a bit more private sector-y, if you like, and that would be part of the reason for doing it.
Conscious of comments that members have been saying, mentioning here, convener, but on the whole scrutiny issue there. I mean, the ALIOs are not new; they've been around for a while. Maybe there's a kind of acceleration of the pace of change here with them, but I think it'd be a concern. Share some of the concerns that members have got about the accountability, and we wouldn't want these functions to slip through the net public gaze, particularly for a committee like this with such, large amounts of public money going through that route to the ALIO. So I'd probably be looking for something, and I don't know whether Audit Scotland even has the power to, probably not from the answers that you've given so far, but I think there needs to be some kind of scrutiny, national scrutiny, so we can see A, how they're performing and whether we're getting the kind of value for money that we seek. Could I raise a wee point on the chart that you've shown on page 17? It's about workforce, changes in the workforce numbers by age groups. One of the boxes there shows that in the under-20s, I know this is a small proportion of the entire workforce across these sectors you're looking at, but there's quite a drop there in the under-20s, it suggests there. But your comment over the page there, on page 32, seems to suggest that there's been a targeted approach to increase the numbers of 16 and 24-year-olds, for example, in that range, and that's going up. So could you explain what's been happening there? Why did it drop so high? It's dropped 25%, for example. And what's going on there with that recruitment that seems to be suggested in paragraph 32?
In broad terms, I think our concern is exactly the one you're highlighting, that the workforce is ageing. The only age group shown on that chart that's getting bigger is the 50 to 59 age group. Those are all people who are likely to be retiring in the next 15 years or so on average. And again, it's another reason I think for organisations having good workforce plans is that they understand where that workforce is located, the jobs they're doing, whether it might lead to a shortage in 10 years' time of teachers or social workers or other groups, and how they plan to compensate for that to make sure they've got the staff they need in the right place and have got succession planning happening as a continuing thing for the longer term. On the specific point raised in 32, Andrea, I think, has got the detail on that.
Okay, thank you. The drop is quite simply because bodies stopped recruiting, and when they stop recruiting, it tends to affect the younger ones more, and it's a smaller group, so you see the drop more significantly in terms of a percentage. In terms of what they're doing, when we spoke with some of the bodies in our case studies, they recognised the effect that that was having on the workforce and the fact that there weren't young people coming in with new skills and new thinking, and they've simply gone out of their way to just try and open up the doors and bring some more in. Simple decision.
I was wondering whether that was also responsible for transfers, explainable by transfers. I mean, some of the leisure trusts that I know, there's quite a lot of young people involved in that, so I was wondering if there was a transfer of the younger, a higher proportion of younger staff through to the ALIOs, leisure trust ALIOs, and might that be responsible? But if you think it's a recruitment issue, then it seems to be being addressed by some of the councils by paragraph 32 there. I think.
Of the issue, I think the question is whether those increases are big enough to make an impact on the overall pattern you see in Exhibit 4, which is definitely of an ageing workforce and ageing more quickly than we all are because of reductions in the younger groups and increases in the older group as people move into it and aren't replaced further down.
Question, can you just, it's on the whole kind of issue of service redesign, and quite a common message in Audit Scotland reports. You can see this message appearing again and again, that we're asking the government and various partners to provide strategic guidance on how we can redesign service and work better and so on and so forth. We've been saying that for a wee while, but how do we get a handle on how that's progressing? That seems to be the key to the future, to really make an impact in these kinds of issues here. It's probably expecting too much of yourselves to put more direct recommendations there, but your helpful guides at the back of some of your reports kind of take us some way along that route, I think, and there isn't one in relation to this that I think I can recall in previous Audit Scotland reports. So do you think we're where we would like to be in the whole service redesign agenda? Do we need to do more? What does it look like, and when might we see that kind of thing coming in front of the Audit Committee for us to scrutinise progress there?
I think the first bit of good news is that there will be a good practice guide associated with this that we're planning to publish in January. Yeah, so that will be available for public bodies to use. Yes, that's right. And I think our experience is that it's easiest, still difficult, but easiest to get a handle on exactly how that reform and redesign is going by looking at a specific service rather than by looking across the piece, because that's how you can get a handle on how public bodies are understanding the scale of the problem, looking at the options they've got individually and together, and then putting in place plans to achieve it. The indications are, though, that public bodies find that quite difficult to do. Members here will know, and some members in particular, that the integration of health and social care in Highland has been a year ahead of what's happening elsewhere in Scotland. And we've, I think, learned some quite useful things about the challenges of bringing workforces together, even in a way which is really about, at this stage, like-for-like replacement as a basis for redesign further on. And what we hear is that people would welcome more guidance from government, however that's produced, on how you tackle some of those difficult issues around terms and conditions, around different pension schemes and the pension liabilities that come with them, around how the short-term costs of integration that sometimes arise can be managed. So we don't have a magic wand to tell people how to do that part of it, but it does feel to us that if we're going to make real progress on integrating health and social care, changing the way early years services are delivered, looking at really reducing reoffending across Scotland's communities, getting a handle on some of those very important workforce issues is one of the triggers that will help to release real change in the future.
You kind of gather, I don't know, but performance is the right word, but will you gather data to let this committee know at some future date about how the service redesign agenda has been working, what the kind of savings are, what kind of services are working together amongst councils and so on? Will we see something like that in the future? Do you think at this
do is play those big reform programmes into our programme of performance audits and decide at an appropriate point to have a look at health and social care integration, early years, reoffending, the other areas where people are trying to really make a step change in both prevention and partnership working, and look at what we can learn from the progress that's been made so far.
Okay, great, thank you.
Just before I bring in Ken McIntosh, can I come back to the point Willie Coffey raised about the ALIOs and accountability? And I know that many of them, if not all, when they're established, there is usually one or more councillors from the local authority that sit on their board, and that's supposed to create a relationship, at least have some element of feedback to the local authority. But is it not the case that anyone who sits on the board of an ALIO has a prime responsibility to the ALIO as a board member rather than to the council?
Yes.
And is that a legal requirement?
Yes. So that one of the things we spent quite a long time on in that report that we published a couple of years ago was, for elected members, it's an enormously difficult balancing act, because if you're acting as a company director or as a trustee of that charity, when you're wearing that hat, your only responsibility is to that charity or that company. So that is a very difficult balance for them to strike, and in places where it really hasn't worked well, partly it's been because people haven't been clear about the roles and responsibilities. So that's exactly right, Convener. That's one of the tensions that there are.
So if a local authority says that it has some influence on the ALIO because it has a number of elected members on the board, then that is just not true, because those elected members are sitting there as independent representatives on the board with no requirement, and indeed should not carry out any council policy or functions when making decisions on behalf of that ALIO.
So the technical position is absolutely that, and colleagues in Oscar would be very clear that if you've got a councillor sitting as a trustee of a charity, then that's their primary responsibility. I guess councils would also argue, though, that as an elected representative, as a councillor, you bring a perspective from the community to the board. So it's not, so absolutely they're not there formally representing the council, but as someone who has links with and is representative of the community that ALIO serves, you would argue that it's an entirely reasonable appointment to have on the board of that organisation.
Any councillor that attempts to bring council influence to that ALIO is acting out with the terms of their responsibility as a board member.
Well, depend on entirely on the makeup of the ALIO, but that's absolutely one of the tensions that councillors have to manage. Yeah, it's not straightforward.
Convener, can I just highlight in that regard the same tensions apply in relation to the arm's length foundations that are being established in the FE sector at the moment. It's exactly the same question of how you, on the one hand, maintain independence and, on the other hand, maintain accountability.
We'll come to that later on. Ken McIntosh. Sorry, is it on this issue?
Yeah. It was just
right. Okay, I'll bring Colin in and then Ken.
Thanks very much, Convener. It was just in terms of what you're saying about the relationship between councillors, arm's-length companies and the likes, which is kind of taking me back to my days when I used to be one. Did you find that there was in many of these arm's-length companies, there was a structure in place where the board of the ALIOs would feed into some sort of governing structure board that takes in all the ALIOs for the particular local authority?
It happens. We obviously haven't looked at that as part of this work, Mr. Keir, I should say, first of all, but from other experience, the picture varies, and that's exactly one of the things that we've asked auditors to report back on this year, is exactly what are the governance arrangements that councils have in place in relation to their ALIOs. Some councils, I think, like Glasgow, have a centralised model, as you've just described it, where they have a committee that oversees how all of their ALIOs work, because obviously that's a very big part of how Glasgow deliver their services. In other places, for example, it will be the council's Leisure and Education Committee that will have oversight of the Leisure Trust, and it will be the care-related one that will. So there are different models, but I guess, and it's not for us to say which is a good model or a bad model. What we're interested in is that they have a model of governance that is appropriate and ensures oversight for the good use of the public money.
Right, we'll leave it there.
Sorry, can I just ask a question on that then? You know, it's triggered other thoughts. Does an ALIO have a requirement to provide any information to a council any more than information it would provide to an interested member of the public?
The vast majority do have, as part of that set-up agreement with the council, a requirement to report into the council on performance and budget arrangements. So the majority do, and we would certainly look to see that those kinds of arrangements are in place.
And that doesn't affect their charitable status?
No, I think there's a difference between having control and influence and reporting to a committee of a council. I think I mean, it's difficult to comment too widely because a lot will depend on the specifics of how these things are set up.
Ken McIntosh.
Thanks, Convener. Can I just ask, first of all, a question about the overall numbers? I was just slightly confused in the Managing Early Departures report from earlier this year. Part 2, you said the number of staff employed in the Scottish public sector has fallen. Has fallen by about 40,000 since 2009, but clearly in today's report you're saying it's fallen by 26,000. Just wondering, just to clarify my own head.
It's a very good example of the lack of consistent information that's readily available. The earlier report was based on simply what is published on the headline statistics. This report has let us drill a bit more deeply into the figures and understand them more thoroughly. Angela, do you want to? Andrew can help us give you the detail on that.
Other big differences that the early departures report included police and fire, and this audit doesn't. So when we take those things out, I think you'll find parity between the numbers.
If you take police and fire out, that can't account for 14,000, surely.
Talking about absolute numbers of people.
Well, again, I was going to ask that. Just obviously, you talk about whole-time equivalent, and in today's report, the public sector report, is whole-time equivalent. Do you know what the figure is for headcount as opposed to whole-time equivalent?
Yes, I do, but I haven't got it with me. I can get that for you.
Is one of them is the earlier one, is the Managing Early Departures headcount?
We think that's part of the difference, that the early departures one focused on headcount because that was what was readily available. Here we've done some more work to convert to whole-time equivalents, which accounts for some of the difference too.
And as part of your analysis, have you looked at within breaking down those jobs the use of overtime, the use of part-time staff, and so on, the way that jobs have changed within the public sector?
We haven't done for this piece of work. We've taken the data as far as we can for the purpose of this, but it's an entirely appropriate question to ask. I think particularly against the backdrop of that more flexibility across workforces in general, and the concerns that are being expressed about a sort of two-tier workforce of people within the public sector with more employment protection, generally better terms and conditions, and people outside the public sector or in arm's length organisations who may have less of that. I think it's an area we're increasingly interested in, as it becomes clear that those people outside public sector employment still give rise to public sector costs, if I can put it that way. So we're increasingly interested in it, but it's not something we've explored in this particular piece of work.
It's not just the private sector. I mean, there's plenty of zero-hours contracts in universities and elsewhere as well. So just here, have you looked at, for example, the use of, there's a concern that in some cases, when posts are gone, that consultants are hired. This is aside from ALIOs and outsourcing, that consultants and others are brought in to fill behind jobs that are lost. Did you look at any of that at all?
Not directly in this case, but it's something our auditors are very interested in as they carry out their audit work. You'll see in here that there are a few examples we've found of where services have been cut or radically changed as a result of budget pressures, and yet we know a lot of money has come out of some public services over the last 3 or 4 years since the austerity regime came into effect. And what we're interested in understanding better is the sort of behind-the-scenes impact of those reductions now, which may not be visible in terms of service levels or service quality, but which may be storing up problems for the future. And we have indications, for example, from some of our auditors about concerns in weakening the capacity of the finance function in some public bodies. We're keeping a close eye on that. And one of the things that we are recommending in this piece of work is that public bodies themselves need to be more systematic in looking at the effects of changes they're making to their workforces and at unintended costs like the need to backfill with temporary staff or consultants that may also come through. That's very much why we're making the recommendation that we are about that systematic monitoring of the impact of changes in the workforce.
Just briefly on Exhibit 7, which comes from the survey where we just asked what methods are the bodies using. You'll see kind of towards the bottom of the list there, using more consultants and agency or temporary staff. So 12 councils, 1 health board and 9 Scottish Government and central bodies are reporting that they have done that. Now, we haven't gone to the next level and tried to understand exactly why or how or what that looks like, but that's how the bodies themselves are reporting that an increased use in those kind of people.
Yeah, I was really just trying to find out what the what the policy behind this is. I mean, clearly all these bodies have to make savings, and staff costs are, the main way to make savings here. But clearly using, I'd have thought that public policy would be against using consultants. We heard from the Chief Constable last week about, he says, it's not a policy to have backfilling, but it happens on a day-to-day basis when you lose staff. So clearly these things are happening. I think you say it, talking about the NHS, you talk about the fact that spending on bank and agency, nursing and midwifery staff has risen from 90.5 million in 2010 to 110 million in 2012-13. So I'm just getting a mixed picture about, whether we're getting more use of those sort of posts. In other words, we're losing permanent jobs in the public sector, but actually we're just replacing them with expensive or potentially more expensive consultants and part-time workers.
I think the honest answer is that it's not a straightforward picture. It's clearly not a good use of money to make somebody redundant or to choose not to fill their post and then spend more on backfilling with temporary staff or consultants. But there can be circumstances in which it's a good policy, and a couple of examples to illustrate that. If the work is cyclical or there's a short-term peak while restructuring is going on, it might be quite sensible to use a temporary member of staff to cover that, who can then be let go when better arrangements, better value for money arrangements are in place in the longer term. And equally, it might make sense to keep an established post vacant or a number of established posts vacant while a regrading exercise is going on or while new jobs are being designed and recruited to. So while on the face of it, it may look as though it's always always poor value for money. Our experience is that it's more mixed than that. Again, I think it comes back to this recommendation we make that there should be better monitoring and reporting of the impact of workforce changes, and particularly an eye out for those sorts of unintended consequences and costs that can come if it's not managed well.
Were there any examples that stood out as examples of poor value?
Angela, anything you'd like to highlight from the report?
The banking midwifery nurses, I thought, would be.
No, we've made the point in several pieces of work before that bank nurses can be a very good way of filling the need for support on particularly busy wards that have the need for a constant level of staff, and to attract back into the workforce nurses who might otherwise have left because they couldn't balance it with domestic responsibilities or lifestyle preferences. Agency nurses tend to be less good, both because they're more expensive and because the nurses don't know the hospital and its systems as well, so it's poorer quality. But that's a good example, I think, of where some of that expenditure is probably a very sensible use of money and some of it is not and should be managed down as quickly as possible. It highlights the need to understand what's going on behind the figures, I think.
I also noticed there was a figure, just actually Exhibit 7 that Fraser McKinley highlighted. There's only 12 examples, all councils, I think, of compulsory redundancies. There are other, colleges have had thousands of compulsory redundancies. Were they not included in this survey? Is that?
This data comes from the survey of 80 bodies that we carried out, and I'll ask Andrea to talk you through which bodies were part of that.
Just to answer your question simply, we didn't include colleges in this audit.
You did?
No.
Because there are, would you recognise that there is widespread use of compulsory redundancies, or there has been over the last few years?
I don't think we have the data to answer the question specifically, but the reason why we didn't include either colleges or police and fire in this piece of work was because there's so much deliberate reform work going on, and we thought it would make more sense to review both of those separately as specific pieces of work that would let us answer those questions, rather than doing it in the broad approach we've taken to this report.
Could you provide us with a list of the 12 organisations where there have been compulsory redundancies? Okay.
They're all councils. Can I just find out? I want to ask about experience. Again, the difficulty here is who's leaving in the public sector and what impact does that have in services? And again, it's a very mixed picture seems to be emerging here. You talk at various, I think it was paragraph 99, you talked about there are service cuts which are quite small scale. You talked about grass cutting and so on. But then another paragraph at, I think it was 35, you talked about the fact that we've lost 2,000 teachers or so in the last couple of years, and the pupil to teacher ratios are increasing. In other words, class sizes must be going up, I would imagine. These are going to have a direct effect, I would have thought, on the quality of the public service offered. Do you detect a strong policy about protecting the level of service, the quality of service, or do you find it a mixed picture there as well?
I think we say in the report evidence about the effect on service quality and service levels is hard to come by because it's not clear that all public bodies are monitoring that as systematically as we think they should. I think our experience is that all public bodies are doing their best to protect public services, and that's probably why we found so few examples of services being cut or dispensed with altogether. But in terms of our understanding, your understanding and public understanding of the impacts of the financial pressures public services are working under, we think it's very important that there is a more systematic monitoring and capturing of that sort of impact, and very specifically planning for particular services like education, like social care, like healthcare, what the likely impact is of an ageing workforce at a time of rising demand and increasing expectations that we all have. That's what the workforce plans would let the bodies responsible answer, and what would let them identify more innovative ways of managing those pressures by partnership working and redesigning services and jobs.
Just finally, if I may, Convener, just clearly one of the biggest worries you highlight is the limits now on, in certain sectors, of early departure schemes, of reducing the workforce further, the potential for, which implies that there will be even greater pressure perhaps on on pay and so on. Were you able to make a comparison between the money saved in the public sector by pay freezes and pay controls versus reducing the size of the public sector?
What we've done here is to highlight the overall changes we've seen, the changes in the workforce numbers due to different exit routes, if I can summarise them like that: early retirements, early departures, posts not being replaced, and transfers to arm's length bodies and private sector organisations, and the overall cost. But it's not possible to break down at the moment the differences between the contribution made to cost reduction from the different mechanisms set out in Exhibit 7. We were able, I think, in our report on early departures to give some assurance about the payback period for the investment made in early departures. But there obviously is a wider cost to having fewer people employed in the public sector if there aren't jobs elsewhere that can absorb those people. That's not a straightforward trade-off to be made, and it's something which doesn't offer many alternatives in the current financial climate. But it is a difficult challenge, and again, it's why we think that information about the impact of the workforce changes here and about the terms and conditions of the sort of hidden public sector workforce, if I can phrase it like that, in arm's length organisations and in private sector bodies is so important to get a sense of what those trade-offs are and to allow you as elected representatives to make decisions about them and the wider public to understand the impact.
Thank you, George.
Finally, can I ask Fraser McKinlay, you said that there was some evidence that with the personalisation of care agenda that some services were transferring to arm's-length bodies. What I understand is also happening with the personalisation of care agenda is that individuals are able to buy their own care, so they can either buy from private sector companies or indeed buy from individuals who wish to be employed to provide a service. Have you been able to quantify the number of posts that are affected in that way?
No, we haven't, Convener, but to trail a piece of work that is coming in spring, we are doing a report, a joint report for the Commission and the Auditor-General on reshaping care for older people, and that is obviously looking at how that policy is being implemented and how that's being delivered. So you can watch the space on that one.
Thank you. Okay, can I thank the Auditor-General and Angela Cullen, Fraser McKinlay and Andrew Laird for their evidence, and we'll move to the next item on the agenda, and I'll suspend the meeting for a few minutes to allow the changeover. Could reconvene the meeting, that would be good. Can I welcome Leslie Evans, who's the Director-General of Learning and Justice in the Scottish Government, Andrew Scott, the Director of Employability, Colin Robertson, who's the Team Leader, Sponsorship and Funding, and Melanie Weldon, who's the Team Leader, Post-16 College Regionalisation, all of the Scottish Government. Welcome to the meeting. I believe, Leslie, that you would like to make an opening contribution.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to provide evidence to the committee in response to the Auditor-General's reports on the further education sector. We found the reports helpful and we've addressed or are addressing their recommendations. I am here in my capacity as the Accountable Officer for the Scottish Government's Education and Lifelong Learning portfolio, and I know that the committee heard last month from Lawrence Howells, who's the Accountable Officer at the Scottish Funding Council. So I think it's worth recapping perhaps our different but complementary roles in that respect. So I'm responsible for ensuring that the Funding Council's strategy and delivery aligns with the Scottish Government's priorities and that it has the necessary controls in place to safeguard public funds. Lawrence is accountable for the delivery of those Scottish Government policy objectives, the deployment of resources to that end, and the associated planning and risk management. The quality of our close and effective relationship with the Scottish Funding Council is fundamental to the success of Scottish Government reforms. This reform takes three forms. Firstly, as you know, a programme of structural change, largely complete, and this has transformed the college landscape. The Scottish Government recognises it has demanded massive effort from the sector and has not been without its challenges, but it has created the right foundations and framework to deliver the improvements for learners and employers which inform and drive our reform programme. Learning provision will now be planned and funded on a regional basis for the benefit of learners. I try to visit colleges regularly so that I can hear direct from leaders and teachers and learners about their experience. And I've been struck by the commitment, drive and ambition to realise the advantages of this new regional landscape. For example, I was in Dundee recently and heard from Christina Potter about the way in which she and her team are shaping the new Dundee and Angus College curriculum to reflect the regional economy. In addition to this structural change, the Scottish Government's second strand of reform is a systemic approach to improvement, and the Funding Council is negotiating outcome agreements to ensure greater transparency on the Government's return for investment and greater accountability for delivery and continuous improvement. This focus on outcomes will help drive improvements in colleges offered to both learners and employers. And finally, the third strand of the Scottish Government reform programme is focused on governance and leadership, commensurate with our expectations and our investment, and realised by the implementation of the Post-16 Education Scotland Act. A reform programme of this scale and ambition is challenging, and Audit Scotland's reports this year and last have captured areas for our continued attention, some of which we'll no doubt discuss today. However, the reforms are by no means complete, and colleges will need continued support to realise the full benefits of mergers, to focus on improvement with an eye on learner success, and to strengthen the partnership working that this entails. And the recent report by Sir Ian Wood contains interesting recommendations for colleges, employers and schools in this last respect. I'm happy to answer questions, as are my colleagues here, Convener. Thank you.
Can I ask you about the issue of reclassification of colleges? The decision about whether to reclassify or not to reclassify, was that one that you made?
It's a ministerial decision, but clearly we advised ministers about it. And they were very keen to look at three things when taking that decision. Firstly, the substantial investment of public money in the sector, as you know, £500 million or thereabouts each year. And they wanted to ensure that they could maintain transparency and accountability, very important to keeping learner and taxpayer confidence in that respect. 75% of college income is from the public sector, so that was another key part and reasoning behind the Minister's decision. And they also felt that their decision was in keeping with Russell Griggs' report, which talked specifically about governance and improving governance in the further education sector, particularly after some historic incidents. But also he talked about a real cohesive engagement between the Scottish Government and the sector as a whole, and our interdependency in that respect and our work on outcome agreements paints a particular and quite a unique approach to the way that we're developing further education in association with the rest of the education sector.
It is a ministerial, or it was a ministerial decision. What are the financial implications of that decision?
Directly or overall, there are none, in that colleges will still be funding college learning. They will be going through a slightly different process to access some of their financing. They will be reporting slightly differently to the SFC, though not excessively more in terms of their financial information and data that they supply. But other than that, we're taking steps, as you know, to mitigate some of the circumstances that have arisen through the decision about ONS and reclassification.
There are no implications, so what is it that you're mitigating then?
Well, what we're trying to do is ensure, and Colin maybe wants to come in on this in some of the more detail, but what we're trying to do is to make sure that the constraints which are placed through the route of reclassification have minimal impact on the way that colleges operate across the further education sector. So, for example, there is a change to the fiscal year. Currently they operate in an academic year, and that is part of the Scottish Public Finance Manual. And also we have created, as you know, or in the process of creating arm's length foundations to ensure that reserves and money that would otherwise revert back to the Scottish Government at the end of financial year remains accessible for colleges.
So there are financial implications?
Not financial in terms of cost, financial in terms of process.
I didn't ask in terms of cost. I asked whether there were any financial implications, and you said there were none. But now it appears that there are financial implications.
There are financial implications in terms of process, financial process.
Yeah, so there are financial implications to such an extent that colleges are now having to consider setting up arm's-length organisations. Now, I don't know if you were able to hear from the video feed the discussion in the previous session about arm's-length organisations, but some of the concerns that have started to be expressed about arm's-length organisations which councils have set up is that these arm's-length organisations have actually no direct accountability to the bodies that set them up, that once they are set up, they are independent bodies, and that they are required for legal reasons and reasons of regulation from the charity regulator to operate in the best interests of that arm's-length body. So how can we be sure that a college which sets up either an arm's-length body or decides to participate in the centralised arm's-length body which has been set up, how can we be sure that that arm's-length body will actually return all of the money to that college in the way that the college hopes that it would be done?
Well, the first thing that we are taking great care to describe at the moment are the Articles of Association, that those are very closely defined so that they reflect the purpose for that college or those colleges in that region, and also are in line with the ministerial and college priorities. So the defining and describing of those Articles of Association will be a very important part and a very important safeguard, because that will be what the Arm's Length Foundation will be evaluated against in terms of its spend and its activity. You mentioned it will also be subject to charitable law and to the scrutiny and audit of the charity regulator. But the other issue here is that in terms of accessing funding, colleges will apply to the Arm's Length Foundation for the money that they require. And the money, as soon as it goes into the colleges, is subject to the same kind of scrutiny as any other finance would be.
It comes back into the college.
That's right.
But given that the college are putting money into the arm's length body, who ultimately makes the decision about whether any money comes back from that arm's length body? Is it the college or is it the arm's length body?
The college applies to the Arm's Length
Yes,
Foundation.
but who makes the decision?
The college decides that it needs money and goes to the
Yeah,
Arm's
so the
Length
college
Foundation.
makes a decision that money will
Yes.
come back to the college from the arm's length body.
It applies.
That's astonishing.
It applies to the foundation to.
Yes, so who makes the decision?
The trustees of the arm's length body.
So the arm's length body makes a decision and not the
Yes.
college. So the college has no say over whether money comes back to the college or not. It's the arm's length body that makes a decision. Is that correct?
The arm's length body will evaluate and consider the college's application and then pass funding back
So
to the
who
college
makes the
on those
decision?
lines. Well, the trustees will take that decision in that
The
respect.
trustees of the arm's length body.
I think I'm correct in saying that.
Right.
Colin, is that correct?
So the college has no say over that decision.
Except that the college prompts the decision in the first instance.
Yeah, but it's like me making an application to a charitable trust. I make an application, so I prompt the application, but I've got no say over whether a charitable trust gives me any money, do I?
I think the colleges would expect, and certainly would expect, the arm's length trustees to be transparent about the basis on which they're evaluating the request. And they have a set of articles of association which will define very closely the kinds of projects and
the colleges
spend.
may expect, you know, it's a bit like, you know, Nelson, but colleges may expect, but colleges actually have no say. And one of the things that's coming out from the discussions that we're hearing about arm's length bodies is the trust and that's set up by local government, is that the trustees have a legal and fiduciary responsibility to the arm's length bodies to take decisions that are in the best interests of the arm's length bodies. They are not legally responsible to the colleges, are they?
No. And I think you put your finger on it there, Convener, in that the trustees must be responsible for to spend money in line with the Articles of Association. And much of this will depend on the appropriate crafting of those Articles of Association so that there is minimal room for lack of clarity or confusion about the spend.
To whom are these arm's length bodies accountable?
Well, they're accountable to the Articles of Association in terms of the transparency of how they spend their money.
Which
but they
is
are
to themselves?
Trusts. Well, they are trusts, so therefore with charitable status they're also accountable in terms of how they perform and how they're audited with the charities regulator. But they are arm's length trusts. They are arm's length from the government. That's one of the reasons.
So it's like the ALIOs that have been set up by councils. They are responsible to themselves, and you know, in the case of councils, not to the councils. And in these bodies, these trusts will be responsible to themselves and not to the college.
That's
for
correct.
Substantial amounts of public money which have been transferred out of the colleges and into the trusts.
And to be spent in line with the Articles of Association.
Yeah, notwithstanding the Articles of Association, and we know the reasons for it, as we do know the reasons for councils setting up arm's length bodies. The issue is then, once established, to whom are these bodies accountable, and what we've heard in previous discussions is that these bodies are accountable only to themselves. Now, in the case of colleges, which we're discussing now, colleges will transfer their money, public money that you said, 75%. Some of it might be private, but it's 75% public money. Colleges will transfer that public money to these arm's length bodies. These arm's length bodies are only accountable to themselves, subject to the Articles of Association. They are not accountable to the colleges, and the colleges have no say over how that money is spent, or have no say on whether that money comes back to them or not.
I'm not sure. I would be corrected in terms of whether they're able to say anything about whether money comes back to them or not, but certainly the process that will be established is that the colleges apply to those trusts.
If you can't say, who can tell us whether the colleges have a say in whether money comes back to them or not?
Well, I would say it does say that because they're applying. I would say the colleges do have that say because they are applying for the funding. So other colleges for another region could apply to an arm's length foundation, which is not in their region, and they would not be.
I don't know what West College in Mon area will do, but just supposing they set up their own arm's length body, they cannot have any say on whether any money comes back to them or not, because that would then compromise the independence of that trust. They have to rely on the trust to make the decision. Is that not correct?
The trust are the people who are responsible to take decisions in regard to the foundations.
So the college would have no say in whether or not any money comes back. It will be the trust that makes that decision.
The trust would take a decision about allocation of funds to the college. Of course, the Articles of Association will be closely defined. So if they don't spend money on that college, they wouldn't be spending money at all.
And the trust will not be accountable to the college in any way?
No.
No. So to whom is the trust accountable other than to themselves?
The trust is accountable to themselves based on the Articles of Association that have described their function
and not to
their
ministers?
parameters. They're not responsible to ministers.
And
They
not
are
to
arm's length.
anybody in the Scottish Government either?
No, not to the government.
Okay. Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. Can I just ask, I've just recently taken over my party's education portfolio for further and higher education, so I've just become aware of this Office of National Statistics reclassification. However, I do understand that it was announced in October 2010, so it's been out there for 3 years. In England, they've gone down a different path and they've allowed colleges to carry on the way they're doing, and as a former lecturer, I think there's no doubt of the success of our FE colleges since incorporation. Can I ask, could the ONS reclassification, could it have been stopped in Scotland? Was it a choice? You may not have wished to go down the same road as England, I appreciate that, but was there a choice, as the accountable officer, whether to go ahead with ONS reclassification or not? Was there something you could have done to stop it?
Had to respond to reclassification being imposed, and so there were various routes, and different parts of the UK, as you say quite accurately, have taken different approaches. So England and Wales have avoided reclassification. Northern Ireland and ourselves have decided to go down a different route. So there was, as the convener asked earlier on, there was a decision, and we discussed the implications of that decision with ministers. At the time when it was first described, I think we were sometime around the late summer in 2010 made aware of the likelihood of this. It wasn't clear exactly what those options would be, or indeed what the implications might be, and it's taken quite a bit of time to unpack some of that, not just ourselves but in correspondence with the Treasury in Whitehall about what the implications might mean, and therefore ministers taking a decision about whether they wanted to go down that route or not. England have taken, I was going to say England have taken a particular route in that they've decided to go down and appoint a further education commissioner. But that sets up a very different relationship with the government then.
Yeah, I appreciate that. But you did have options when this was proposed, and you decided to go down the reclassification route. Correct. I submitted a parliamentary question to the Secretary for Education to ask what the benefits of reclassification of further education colleges were, and the answer was none. So why did you choose to go down a route where there were no benefits to further education colleges?
Because of ministers' understanding and view about the disadvantages of going down the alternative route, which I referred to earlier, namely this nature of the funding package within Scotland, the high proportion of public funding and the high level of investment in there. But secondly, because of what we were looking at in great detail through the Griggs report on governance and accountability and the history of governance and accountability within the college sector. So ministers took a decision based on those circumstances, looked at what the alternative route to the one they have now chosen might mean, and in compromising some of those important aspects, and particularly also are very close, not just in terms of governance and accountability, but were very clearly cited on the importance of maintaining a strong and effective partnership work with the funding, with the further education college sector, not just on its own, but as part of a wider education journey, including higher education, schools and so on. So there were a range of reasons why they decided to take that route.
There were disadvantages in not going down this route, but there are no benefits from going down the route.
I think
could we not be looking at... I mean, the colleges are a wonderful success story in Scotland, and I think the merged colleges will be even greater, and we fully support that. So if there are no benefits, and I've yet to meet a college principal who thinks it's a good idea, why is this happening?
Benefits are, from ministers' point of view and from the advice that they were presented with, and they weighed up the options. It wasn't a decision quickly or easily taken. But ministers' points of view were that we would preserve and enhance the governance and accountability, which was already under discussion, under debate as part of our reform, as part of the Griggs review, and indeed as part of the post-16 subsequent legislation which has been passed. So this wasn't taken in isolation from a package of reform, and for ministers' views about the importance, as you say quite rightly, of the further education sector and the very substantial amounts of funding which go into it each year.
Just on this issue then, if the main reason, as you've now said twice in your opening statement and now, was to preserve and enhance the governance and accountability, were there problems there about the governance and accountability of colleges that the ONS reclassification has allowed you to improve?
Griggs' report cited some circumstances, historical, where the governance had been less than perfect in some instances in some colleges. And Griggs also made some very specific recommendations about the quality of governance being very important for the ambitions for the further education sector in future. So from that point of view, it was always going to be important from Minister's perspective to at least maintain a close relationship with colleges and to maintain an access to governance and accountability and a quality of governance and accountability within the sector. And I would just go back to the other point which I made earlier on, which is about the cohesion, real cohesive engagement between further education sector and the Scottish Government. And I spoke earlier on about the accountable officer roles, which are different for myself and Lawrence. But the very close relationship that we have with the Funding Council is part of that cohesion and part of the changes and reforms that we're bringing about to preserve the great standards that are in further education and to see how we can develop those further with an outcome focus in the future.
I'm not convinced, but I'll move on. In your opening statement, you said that you'd set down the right foundation for learning. There's been a loss of 143 part-time students. Teaching staff costs, the budget has fallen by 69 million in 2 years. Now, I think all of us round the table are very much in favour of the Wood Report and the Wood Commission. Are the drastic cutbacks in further education, does that help you to set down the right foundation for learning?
What we've been trying to do and what ministers have set out in their letters of guidance is to ask the Funding Council to support the sector in focusing on particular sectors of our community. And at the time when they did that, they were particularly keen to ensure that we improve our learner offer for young people, particularly young people who may be coming out and faced with unemployment, 16 to 18-year-olds, but indeed 16 to 24 bracket. And that's what colleges have responded very well to. The ministers also asked them to look at courses which would produce qualifications and skills which employees would recognise. That has inevitably changed the profile of the students at colleges. But it has also meant that at the same time, the standards and the targets that ministers set in 10-11 have not just been met in terms of full-time equivalents, but also actually exceeded. So although we have changed the profile, and that has been a deliberate response to a ministerial instruction, we've maintained high levels of full-time equivalent places. And we also are trying to look and see where that has impacted on other parts of the community. You mentioned part-time learning, and see what we can do to try and counterbalance some of that.
You mentioned the students, but what about the 69 million cut in the teaching budget? Does that allow colleges to move forward and to, accept and build on the work recommended in the Wood Commission?
In terms of the colleges, they will be looking very closely, and I know are looking very closely in terms of the conversations that I have had with colleges at their staffing structures, and particularly as they merge and have merged, they have had to look very closely about the resources in a strategic fashion across what is now a regional, for many of them, a regional organisation. So they've had to look and have looked at voluntary severance and reconstructing their staffing structures to respond to mergers and reform initiatives that have taken place over the past few months. And that has meant that some people have left the college sector, there's no doubt about that. A large proportion of those that have left are actually from the management side of things, where there have been, of course, economies of scale.
Teaching staff, as was outlined in the Audit Scotland report. I'm not talking about management.
I appreciate that, and there has been some changes to teaching staff. 69
million. Just before coming to my last question, can I just go back to the ONS? Am I right in saying that colleges can keep any surpluses that arise from higher education, but they must transfer surpluses arising from further education to the arm's length bodies. Is that correct?
Colleges are allowed to keep are intended to transfer all their surplus over to the foundation. I'm not aware whether there is a differentiation between the higher and the further education courses in terms of the income they create, but I can find that out and return to you on that.
I was told that by the regional lead at UHI, but I would like to find that out. And my final question,
back to you on that.
If you could, thank you. My final question, convener, is a question I've asked several times now. We don't have a regional, well, we have a regional body in the Highlands called the UHI. My concern is that with a 15 million budget and 200 staff, there is no doubt that funds to further education colleges in the Highlands and Islands, the money is top sliced. Are you concerned that that may put these colleges at a disadvantage in terms of providing skills and training and education in future?
Certainly that isn't the intention, and all colleges have been asked to absorb the costs of the reorganisation, including the boards that are being set up within their own, within the Scottish Funding Council's allocation.
Even the Glasgow one, the money for the Glasgow board will be top sliced prior to going to the colleges.
My understanding is that all of the boards and the changes that will be taking place across the college landscape will be absorbed, on that point, will be absorbed by the colleges themselves and the Scottish funding allocation for them.
Just receive less money because more is going to the boards, which will allocate the funds.
Yes.
So they make the decision on the allocation of funds rather than the colleges, and the money is top sliced.
The money will be top sliced, to use that phrase, yes.
Thank you.
Just to say that that's an area that the Funding Council will keep under very close scrutiny to ensure that the costs are kept to a minimum and the maximum resource goes to the front line.
Indeed, I think in terms of the regional strategic body, it's set down it was set down in the financial memorandum about how much was likely to be required to set up the regional bodies where they have multi-college regions, and so there will be a particularly close eye kept on that.
Colin Beattie.
Sorry to have another go at the ONS, but just to clarify, people seem to be drawing a lot of comparisons between what's happening elsewhere and opportunities that there might be to follow the system they used south of the border. My understanding is that the system followed by Westminster effectively semi-privatised these colleges. In other words, the government takes such a step back that the actual controls, apart from in the curriculum, are virtually nil.
It's a very different landscape in England, and there is a high level of private sector investment within the further education sector, and they have a very different relationship with the government as a result of that. They've taken a decision to appoint a further education commissioner. I don't know if, Angie, you want to say something about that role.
Well, the Commissioner has just been announced. It's Dr David Collins, and his powers are around stepping into circumstances of failing colleges. So it is a model in which he is the person who makes recommendations to ministers where a college is doing very badly. That's not what we've tried to create in our own approach to governance, which is something much more collaborative. So the philosophy, the public service philosophy between the appointment of a commissioner on the one hand and our own approach is entirely different.
Through the commissioner, the government in Westminster actually, apart from in certain extreme cases, has very little overview.
That's right. And my understanding, it is my understanding that where the commissioner intervenes down south, there is a likelihood that a college will be reclassified into the public sector. It will cease to be in the private sector. But underpinning it is a quite different philosophy.
The second thing I was going to ask is really a clarification for me. We've talked about funds flowing from the colleges into these arm's length trusts. Can I just clarify? Colleges receive a pot of money from the government. They also raise funds through various means themselves. Various sources, some commercial and so on. Am I correct in saying that the funds that actually go to the arm's length organisations are not the funds supplied by central government directly? It's my understanding is that the resources are going to come from funds raised by the college themselves into the arm's length organisation. I'm not saying that that's not still public money when it comes into the college, but it is from a different source.
Yes, that's my understanding as well. And I think we're talking here very much about reserves, i.e. surplus funding, which otherwise would get into all sorts of financial and accountability problems in terms of the close relationship with the Scottish Government, as ONS reclassification now makes it. So the whole point is that they're able to take reserves that they might otherwise be frozen and place those in an arm's length foundation where they would be able to access those within the terms of the Articles of Association.
Talking about accounting, one of the things that concerned me when I was looking at the Audit Scotland report on Scotland's Colleges 2013 was the fact that there's a pension deficit of £115.3 million at the end of 2011-12. How is that going to be accounted for in the new scenario?
My understanding is that that won't change in terms of the accounting. It will still sit within colleges, but Colin might have a different view on that.
No, that's right. Reclassification has no impact on the pension deficit.
So there's no financial impact for the Scottish Government at all?
Yeah, it doesn't change. And I think it was assessed by Audit Scotland as a tolerable risk within the confines of the report.
I think I was looking at was in the same report was an apparent anomaly. I don't know whether you have the report available to you, but on... if I can find the page now, it's Exhibit 7 on page 17, I think that is. And I was just interested in your comments on this. I'm looking at the college expenditure, and I'm looking at the other, including exceptional costs. I can understand that's gone up, but perhaps I assume that the costs of some of the merger has gone in there. But I'm looking also at the admin costs, which seem to have increased as well, and I would have been expecting that to come down along with other costs, not go up.
Indeed, I would agree with you. I don't know the answer to that, so I won't pretend I do, although I do wonder whether some of the exceptional costs might also be administrative in nature and therefore could be counted in that respect. There are a lot, as you say, of additional one-off tasks and undertakings to be brought to bear as a result of mergers. And so it may well be that those are counted in there, but it's something that we should ask Audit Scotland.
I did the last time, and I don't think I had the figure, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just clarify, Leslie Evans, the comments that you made to Colin Beattie? You confirmed that in terms of the transfer of resources to the arm's length bodies, it would only be surpluses?
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you also said that these surpluses would not come from public sector funding.
Well, I suppose if it's the end of year surpluses, it will be difficult to differentiate between that money which has been brought in and, as a result of entrepreneurial activity.
At the end of
it will be reserves that will be placed in.
But at the end of the year, when they have a surplus that they're considering to transfer, you don't know whether 1 million of that surplus has come from the public sector and 1 million has come from their commercial activities or their fundraising activities. It's just a surplus.
It is a surplus, correct. I don't know, Colin, if you want to say something more on that.
The existing financial and reporting requirements on colleges through the Funding Council to Scottish Government won't change as a result of reclassification, so it will still be visible what, if any, public funds colleges are moving into foundations at the end of the financial year.
Able, at the end of the financial year, if the college is reporting a surplus, they will be able to break that surplus down and say how much of the surplus has come from public funding, how much has come from their commercial activities, and how much has come from fundraising activities. Is that the case?
Of the funding that the Funding Council makes available to colleges, it will be clear how much of that funding has been transferred.
So, are you saying? Wait a minute, are you saying with absolute certainty that when a surplus is declared at the end of the year, that the source of that surplus will be broken down?
It will be visible through the financial reporting.
And does that happen just now, that when a college declares a surplus, you are able to see where the surplus has been generated from, how much of it is attributable to public funding, how much of it is attributed to commercial, how much of it is attributed to fundraising?
Not at the moment, as I understand it, but
it will be in the future.
The expectation, I think, would be that For example, if a college was not going to draw down the level of funding it required from the Funding Council, that would be visible.
No, I'm not asking about drawdown. I'm asking about when they declare a surplus. You're telling me, it's your expectation, and I don't know whether that means it's going to be in the guidance, the regulations, the requirements. You're telling me that in future a surplus will be broken down and we will be able to see how much of that surplus is generated from public funds.
Part of the Funding Council's responsibility in terms of managing surpluses across the wider sector to be able to identify surpluses within individual colleges.
Could you send a letter to me, Leslie, just explaining, or to the committee, just explaining how that will be done in future? Because that then comes on to the other question, is once that surplus is declared and it's broken down into its constituent categories, that the only bit that will be transferred to the arm's length body will be what? The non-public sector funds? Or is it the public sector funds that will be transferred? Which bit of it is then transferred to the arm's length body if there is a surplus? Is it all of it?
My understanding is that all the surplus would be transferred, irrespective of whether it's been generated through a partnership, a private sector or a public sector.
So public sector funds could well be transferred to the public sector body?
If they haven't used all of those public sector funds.
And
that's unusual, but it does happen.
Right, so public sector funds could be transferred, and at the end of the year, colleges will be able to show how much of that surplus is attributable to public sector funding.
It will be difficult. I appreciate what Colin said. It will be difficult to be able to completely disaggregate those things for the simple purpose that colleges use public sector funding to employ all of their staff.
Yeah, I accept it could be difficult. Colin said that there will be an expectation that that will be done.
I'm sure that the Funding Council will want to analyse how that surplus has been achieved. Yes.
You're sure that they would want to, or are you sure that they will have to?
I'm sure they will want to.
So there's no expectation?
I can't be categoric about whether or not there is a written and statutory expectation of them or not, but I'm
Colin,
sure they will
Colin's
want
saying to us that there is an
yes.
expectation, and you're saying that you're not sure.
No, what I'm saying is I can't say that there was any sort of formal statutory expectation. I'm sure that the Funding Council, and we would encourage them to do so, would want to be clear, as will the college, how they have generated, as now, how they have generated any income surplus.
Can you provide whatever requirement there is in writing to us so that we can
write to you on
that?
it, certainly.
Okay, thank you. Ken McIntosh.
Thanks, Convener. And I just wanted to start by looking at the issue of the cuts that are happening in colleges at the moment. Can I ask, is there a link between the size of classes that students attend at college or the hours they have in front of those lectures and the quality of education they receive?
Very difficult one to be able to draw comparators with. The size of the class may be dictated by the nature of the course. So some of those will be theoretical, some of them will be practical. So using size of class only as a comparator is not necessarily a very accurate way of being able to make a robust comparison.
So does it matter? Does the size of class matter? Does the number of hours that students have in front of their class matter as a measure of government success or outcomes, as it were?
Well, I can give you an example of Dundee and Angus, actually. This is a good example where we were talking and I was asking them about the full-time equivalent and the number of hours that requires, and we were talking about the flexibility of that. One of the things that they were saying was they actually want to encourage their young people, not for every course, but for the course they were talking about in this instance, to have more independent learning. So they wanted to try and increase the amount of time that they had as independent learners in keeping with Curriculum for Excellence and with the ambitions for their young people. And that would reduce the amount of time that they were in the classroom. They wanted to make 25%, I think, Mel, I was right in recalling that, 25% of the course time to be independent learning supported by enhanced IT learning hubs, IT learning hub assistance and so on. So that's an example actually of where they feel, and in fact the other thing they said to me was the performance indicators on that course and on that model of course were going up. They were very satisfied about that. So that's my point about having more teaching hours which are measured in terms of the hours in the classroom can be not always a very easy comparable approach to qualitative results. As it happens, they have less hours in the classroom, but their results are going up and we're having successful learners in context of the curriculum for excellence.
There's a very clear link expressed in school education, which is one of the key drivers in government policy to the stated aim of government policy to reduce class sizes at school, and particularly in the earlier years of primary, driven by evidence that class size matters. Are you saying that there is no such evidence that exists for colleges, or that it's not a factor?
I can't say that there's no such evidence. What I am saying is that colleges are thinking, as demonstrated by the Dundee and Angus example, very carefully about the right mix that they have. And that mix, unlike schools, includes job training, theoretical training, independent learning, classroom in terms of the theoretical learning, classroom time. So that mix, they take that into account and look quite carefully at all of that as part of their response to the government's target for full-time equivalent places.
So, are you worried that there will be an increase in class sizes at college over the next couple of years? Are you worried about the current increase and by any forthcoming increase?
I'm more concerned about ensuring that the quality of the learning experience is maintained and improved. And that's why we're taking, the Funding Council and Education Scotland will be taking steps to evaluate the impact of reform and mergers on the quality and the quantitative and qualitative nature of that change for the learner. And that's where we will get a great deal of information and data. The other area where we'll get a lot of information about the learner experience will be through the outcome agreements that are being negotiated and enacted at the moment with the Funding Council, where they're talking directly to colleges about the need locally, about the employment needs locally, about the skill needs locally, as well as what the national framework for their provision.
Can I ask what your expectations are? Do you expect staff numbers to decrease over the next couple of years? There's a forecast 11% real terms reduction in income for the colleges from the Auditor-General. Are you expecting numbers to decrease? If so, by how much? Are you expecting class sizes to increase? If so, by how much? Are you expecting hours to decrease?
We are aware that teaching numbers have reduced and that staff numbers over a whole for colleges have reduced, and that's not surprising given the amount of change and the mergers that are taking place. Colleges will need to continue to keep a careful eye on both the nature of the courses that they provide, the size of those classrooms connected to that, and also the staffing skills that they require to carry out their responsibilities and the emphasis and approach that's been described in their outcome agreements.
Is the government concerned about it?
The government will ask the Funding Council to keep a very careful eye on this, and will also that will be part of their discussions with colleges through the outcome agreements. Yes, we would expect the Funding Council to take that into account.
But you are expecting, just to be sure, you are expecting further staff numbers to fall, or class sizes to increase?
Yes.
Can I just ask, in terms of overall headcount, there's clearly been a substantial decrease, something like 100,000, or more than 100,000 Scots not going to college that were going to college just a matter of 2 years ago or 3 years ago. What do you think the impact has been on those individuals, on the lost opportunities to those individuals?
Well, as I said earlier on, I mean, one of the difficulties in measuring learning is that measures such as headcount can fluctuate depending on course and choice. So it's not necessarily, though I understand it's an easily captured number, it's not necessarily a very consistent approach or a very consistent comparator to looking at levels of learning. We also, that's why we use full-time equivalent. The other point as well is that ministers have deliberately said to the college sector through the Funding Council that we want you to concentrate on young people 16 to 24, and we want you to concentrate on providing courses that will result in skills and in qualifications that are recognised by employers. That will mean that there will be a shift in profile, not just of the student, but in terms of some of the courses. Some of the part-time courses, which don't result in those kinds of qualifications or recognisable skills, have reduced as a result of that. There is no doubt about it.
And what I was just trying to get to is, what has been the impact of that reduction on older people, for example, in Scotland?
I can't say what the impact has been on every older person who has not gone to college. What I can say is that we're aware that whereas some areas in college attendees, women and some people with particular learning needs has stayed, their full-time equivalent numbers have stayed stable, we are aware that for some older people, the numbers have reduced down. And that's one of the reasons why the government has given Funding Council additional money this year and next to target particularly at older learners and indeed at some part-time students as well. So whilst I talked about the change of profile inevitably coming from an instruction from the government to focus on particular parts of the community, we are looking at where we can mitigate some of the impact of that, where we feel that that's necessary and the Funding Council spots it. And they've also been asked to look at the outcome agreements with regional colleges to see where and how they are taking into account the needs in their local population, where they may have a particular elderly or older learner or part-time requirements.
Just to clarify that, you're saying you're not able to assess the impact on older people who have not had the opportunity to go to college, but you have been able to identify the impact on certain vulnerable groups. How were you able to assess that there has been an impact on women and have prioritised resources for them, but not been able to identify any other impact?
We have been able to identify in that, and I may have been confusing the way I answered the question. We know that the numbers in terms of women and in terms of some people with additional learning needs and disabilities, that the numbers have stayed stable. We know that the numbers attending college in terms of older people have reduced slightly. And that's why, as I'm saying, we're taking mitigating action on that in terms of the Funding Council discussions with the outcome agreement and the additional money that has been added. I don't know if anybody else wants to add in on that. Mel?
Additional money of about 7 million in 13-14.
So can I just ask what the impact has been then? So you've identified that there has been an impact, and you've identified additional resources to try and mitigate that. What has been the impact on those women, I think, that you're particularly identifying?
Well, in terms of women, there hasn't. It's remained stable. In terms of older people, the full-time equivalents have gone down slightly. We can send you the figures for that if that would be helpful.
You're just saying that you found extra money?
Yes.
I thought, what did you find the extra money to fund?
For provision of courses for older people and for part-time learning.
Oh, okay. So what has been the impact on older people and part-time which you are mitigating?
We know, as I said, that in terms of full-time equivalents, the numbers of older learners have gone down. And that's one of the reasons why we asked the Funding Council to use the additional funding for older people, particularly older women. And we've provided extra funding this year and next with that, in that respect.
Okay. So it's just simply the numbers have gone down and you want to increase the numbers again?
We've asked the Funding Council to look at that very closely, yes, with additional money and through the outcome agreements.
Okay. Okay. Do you measure demand itself, or how do you, can I ask, how do you measure demand for college places?
What we do is there are two ways of doing this, or there are two aspects to it. One is the Funding Council works with Skills Development Scotland to anticipate what is required in terms of skills in the skills investment plan, so sectorally, and also in regional investment plans. They produce those, and the outcome agreement managers who are negotiating future provision with colleges take that into account alongside what it is that colleges themselves from their local region decree, having spoken to employers and so on. So we have a bottom-up and a top-down approach to forecasting demand in the future.
Can I ask, is demand increasing at the moment, or staying the same, or what's happening with demand?
I mean, I think demand has changed. Demand has changed quite a lot over the past 5 years. Since the beginning of the recession, I can remember with conversations with college principals around that time, they detected a shift towards full-time learning and away from part-time learning right at the beginning of the recession, and they attributed that to people retraining. Over the past 5 years, we've got much better at estimating what's required by employers. We've set up industry liaison groups. We've got a joint skills committee with the Funding Council. We've got outcome agreements which reflect local vocational requirements. And we have skills investment plans and regional skills plans for most of Scotland, or we will have by the end of April in 2014. So my judgment is that over the past 5 years we've seen very substantial changes in the college population, and our shaping of that learning requirement around vocational needs has improved greatly.
It's improved greatly? Right?
Yes, I think it has, yes.
Okay. So just to go back to my original question, then it's changed, but can I just ask you in terms of demand itself, is there growing demand at the moment for, or is there increased demand compared to, let's say, 2 years ago or 4 years ago for college places?
Well, I think it is very difficult to actually estimate demand as a single entity. And this goes back to the issue of waiting lists, where we examined the demand, the proposition that demand was equivalent to waiting lists, and found that it wasn't, because the waiting lists of individual courses contain such a substantial element of duplication. So it is very difficult to actually estimate demand as a whole and to meet it in a single way.
You just found extra money specifically for older learners and part-time learners. Is that a reflection of demand, or is that just simply because those numbers have been cut?
I think it's a reflection of the fact that there was. I think it is a reflection of the fact that people wanted more money to be provided for older learners and women and part-time courses. And one could provide more or less in any circumstance, but nonetheless, ministers chose to meet the requirements that people placed upon them.
Now, I'm just trying to get the bottom of where we might be going. Clearly, the government have got a very specific policy, which is to target and support full-time or longer courses and younger learners. There's a very clear policy. But there is a downside to that policy. I'm just simply trying to identify there's a downside to it, which is that older learners, particularly women returners, and part-time learners are going to suffer. So I'm trying to work out how you measure demand. What process do you have to work out whether or not the economy is suffering, whether those individuals who are missing out on opportunities are suffering? What is the cost of that lost opportunity?
It's an enormously complicated question. The practical answer to it is that regional colleges are trying to estimate demand of various types in their locality. Education Scotland is looking at is doing a thematic review of college application procedures at the moment. Various regional colleges are pooling their knowledge about cross-border flows. All of these things will help a bit, but I do not think it is possible, or it has ever been possible, to quantify the extent of demand in a single figure. And there has always been an element of rationing within the lifelong learning budget, always.
I agree that it's a finite resource. I know. I'm intrigued to know the forces and the pressures, and not just that, the criteria you use, the information and evidence you use to make judgments about who's going to benefit from these funding streams and who's not, because clearly there are some people going to lose out.
Well, clearly the amount of evidence has on any particular group tends to vary, but in 2011 we did know that the long-term effects of unemployment upon young people were more substantial than upon any other group. And between 2008, when the labour market was at its peak, and 2011, when ministers wrote to the Funding Council, the number of unemployed young people in Scotland under the age of 24 very close to doubled. So there was a certain amount of evidence there.
I entirely agree. And at the same time, the effect has been, in terms of headcount, from over 300,000 people going to college, we've now got just over 200,000. So that's a dramatic shift. Now, I agree there was an intention to it, but that's 100,000 people. That's such a vast number of people who are no longer have the opportunity to go to college. And I find it hard to believe that's not having an impact.
The learning has been condensed, and as I opened my remarks with the observation that some people have opted to participate on a full-time basis rather than upon a part-time basis on account of their economic circumstances.
I wanted to ask about pay, unless the other...
Last question then, James Dornan.
All right, it's just to find out, is it still government policy to move towards national pay bargaining? And if so, do you have a date for when that would be in place in the college sector? Sorry.
There's some work already being undertaken, as you may know, from Ian Mackay, who is looking at this very closely. And it is our intention and hope that that group will produce some proposals which would be ready for producing a new construct from the academic year. I think it's 15-16. So there's still some work to be done on this, and in the meantime regional colleges are looking after their own salary circumstances within their regions.
Is it still government policy to introduce national pay bargaining?
Yes.
It is, right. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I was a bit surprised at my colleagues' less than enthusiastic support for young people between 16 and 24. But I'd just like to get in the record that we had the principals of a number of colleges here just recently, and they said that the quality of education seemed to be as high or improving since the changes started. So there doesn't seem to be any evidence that this is having a negative impact on the quality of education in the colleges. I'd like to go back to the discussion that you had with the convener earlier on. I was one of those, we were talking about ALIOs in the earlier session, and I was one of those that was voicing my concerns about ALIOs from previous experience. But can you just confirm to me, or can you reassure me that, for example, the Articles of Association that will be signed beforehand, that there would be action if the board didn't follow those actions of association, and if there was action, who would be taking it and what sort of repercussions would there be?
I'll ask my colleagues to discuss this precise process, but yes, there would be. I mean, apart from anything else, the Articles of Association will define entirely the behaviours and the activities of that foundation, so it will be very important. The other point is, of course, they're under the remit and under the audit of the Charities Commission, who will be seeking to ensure that these new organisations are operating to best effect. I don't know if colleagues can say specifically who would take the action that you ask about.
Well, the Funding Council can't approve the Articles of Association because they are the Articles of Association of an independent body, but it will collect all the Articles of Association in, and it will scrutinise those Articles of Association, and it will do it, I suppose, with particular regard to the Articles of Association of the Umbrella Trust that it published in October, I think, or November certainly. So that will be the benchmark against which it judges their adequacy.
The point I'm trying to make is, and the convener on a number of occasions was suggesting that there may be a case where a college would justifiably be looking for funding from the trust, and the trust refused it. And maybe because of that, they had broken their Articles of Association. What action would be taken if that was the case? Not that I'm suspecting. But sorry, I don't mean to be misrepresenting you, but that was
I did not say that.
It certainly sounded like it from here, but my apologies if that's not what you. That's not exactly what you said, but it certainly was how it sounded. But what I'm asking is, what actions would be taken if the trust didn't behave in a way that we expect the trust to behave?
The trust is answerable to charity law and to OSCAR, so that's two ways in which it's held accountable.
Okay, all right.
There is an independent auditor of accounts as well, so that's three.
Okay, that'll do.
Okay, finished. Sorry, can I just clarify that point that James Dornan brought up? You said, Andrew, that the Scottish Funding Council would scrutinise they would collect them in. Yes. And having scrutinised them, if they didn't like them, what could they do?
I think they'd engage in discussion with the proposed trustees of the charity about whether the Articles of Association were suitable or not.
And if they didn't like them, what could they do?
Well, first of all, we haven't got to that position yet because we haven't yet seen
yes,
the
but
Articles of Association.
You will look at a number of scenarios, and one of the scenarios is if the Scottish Funding Council does not like them, what could they do?
Well, it is possible, and I'm surmising here, to propose alternative Articles of Association and alternative trustees.
Yes. And if the trustees decide not to accept them, what can the Scottish Funding Council do?
the trust is an independent body. It's independent of the funding.
So the Scottish Funding Council, having scrutinised, has no power, has no influence. We can have discussions, but as you say, the trustees are independent. Can I also ask, is it possible at any time in the future for articles of association to be changed?
I'm sure it is, but I'd need to read the model article of association for the Umbrella Trust to tell you how that was possible. But it is publicly available.
But presumably, if you're looking at setting up an Umbrella Trust and you're allowing all these individuals to set up, you would need to know before you advise ministers, or before you advise the ministers, you would need to know whether or not the trusts could change the articles of association at any time in the future, because that would be fundamental.
Well, I think probably the best thing to do would be to write, for me to write to you, setting out the way in which it is intended trust should work at the moment. Because
yes,
the Funding Council is
by all means, you know, tell me what your intentions are. But what I also need to know from you is what is the legal position and whether articles can be changed at any time in the future, because presumably, and I know that you can't tell us what advice you gave to ministers, whether to accept or reject or anything, but presumably you did advise ministers that if you set up these bodies, at some point, could they or could they not change the articles of association, given that they are independent bodies, subject to the normal charity and legal regulations?
The question is very clear, and I will need to come back to you in writing to answer it.
But is that not something that ministers were advised of before the decision was taken?
Well, the setting up of the charitable trust is a matter for the trusts themselves, or the trustees, and the colleges who are creating those trusts.
I'm talking about the political decision to allow these to be set up. Surely you gave advice to the ministers that having set up these bodies, which are the responsibility of the trustees, here is what could happen in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'll need to come back to you in writing about that. I'm sorry, I can't.
So you weren't sure whether ministers were given that advice or not?
I'm not sure what the precise answer to your question is today.
Could I just make a couple of points? I'm sure Andrew will want to make sure that he doesn't give you anything that could be construed to be not absolutely accurate, and so we would want to check that. But it's worth noting as well that of those who have indicated how they want to go down the route of setting up an arm's-length foundation, I think 7 of the college regions so far have opted to go into the Funding Council's umbrella. So more than half, I'm right in thinking, have indicated that they would want to go into the umbrella, which has already published its articles of association, at least in draft.
Yeah, but I'm not asking for that.
No, I appreciate that, but I'm just trying to make the point that we already know what the articles of association are for one of the big trusts. And secondly, I don't have forensic knowledge of charitable law, but my understanding would be that if you wanted to change the articles of association in any particular way or any specific way, you would need to go back to OSCA to ensure that that didn't compromise the charitable
I'm not asking whether or not the articles of association are acceptable or whether they find them compatible with what they intend to do. I'm asking, purely and simply, could they at some point in the future, having discussed with OSCA, could that independent body of trustees ask for the articles of association to be changed? That's the first question. The second question is, were ministers advised that at some point in the future that could or could not happen? Because presumably ministers would need to know what the implications were of any decision which they made.
And they may well have been, but we will get back to you formally on that.
Okay, thank you. Willie Coffey.
Thanks, Convener. I almost forget what I was going to ask. It's been a wee while, but very interested in the discussion that's taking place. Can I remind colleagues and Leslie Evans too that the Auditor-General's report, they take you back to that on page 9. It describes a situation where the financial standing of the college sector is continuing to be generally sound, and I'm picking this from the Auditor-General's report itself. The colleges themselves were reporting a surplus in that year that was reported, 11-12. And they also had accumulated surpluses of £214 million and a combined total of £199 million in cash and cash equivalents. So we're dealing in an environment here where the college's performance and improvement is progressing pretty steadily, despite some of the comments that other colleagues have offered around the table. On top of that, the structural reform process, we're told that the Funding Council expects us to deliver £50 million of saving each year. And there's already been significant progress towards that, as has already been reported to us too. The Scottish Government, I also understand, are providing an extra £61 million to the college sector. And I suppose where I'm leading to now in terms of that discussion that was opening up there, this additional money that the Scottish Government will provide, what could happen to that in terms of the ELFs if at the end of a particular year the college discovers that it has another surplus? Do these funds automatically transfer to the ELFs, or can the colleges decide not to transfer surpluses to the ELFs, and what would happen under those circumstances?
Colleges would decide to transfer that money to the Arm's Length Foundation at the end of the year. Any reserves would go to the Arm's Length Foundation.
Must they, or is it a choice that they make?
My understanding is must.
No, the college could choose not to transfer the funding over, but essentially the funds would then be frozen under government financial requirements.
So effectively,
wouldn't they?
It would be frozen. So maybe not must, but in terms of the incentives to hold on to the money, I think most colleges would elect to put it into the Arm's Length Foundation.
Colleges will make to either to transfer or not to transfer.
It's a choice, but one's not very palatable. Frozen reserves aren't particularly helpful to them.
In terms of the discussion that was going on there about the Articles of Association, could you remind me, please, who is it that will define these? Is it the college with the ELF? Who will define the articles to try to give us the kinds of protections that members have been raising concerns about? Who will define them?
It will be the colleges, but they are being advised and supported by the Funding Council on this. In other words, they have produced an Articles of Association themselves, the Funding Council, and they are sharing those with others as a model which describes the function of the new foundation, where their focus would be, and narrowly defines within the Articles of Association what they would be undertaking, what their role would be the undertaking.
Colleges will principally do that with the Funding Council, so
yes,
there's clearly an interest there to get this right at the earliest possible opportunity to, I hope, provide the kinds of protections that members have been expressing a wee bit of concern about.
Absolutely, and we're in the middle of that process at the moment. As I said, the only person who I think, or the only organisation that has been in a position to share its Articles of Association because it has appointed its trustees. I think all of the trustees are now in place for the Funding Council's umbrella trust, to which over half of the colleges have at the moment indicated they would want to be party to. Because they have their trustees in place, they're able to share and promote what their Articles of Association are about, and also to share those with other colleges as a model.
And overall, in terms of the principle of establishing the ELFs, the Arm's Length Foundation, what is the Scottish Government's view of that? Because despite the discussion about what proportion of the surpluses and so on are actually public money or earned income by the college sector, what's the Scottish Government's view of that pile of cash being pushed to the side, substantially public funds being pushed to the side, and therefore possibly out of the reach of public scrutiny from that point on?
I think it's fair to say that government ministers are not, have not welcomed the reclassification process as it was first intimated to us, or as it has developed. I don't think they would have chosen this as their preferred route. Having decided to take a particular decision about how they approach reclassification, all our work and efforts at the moment are trying to avoid disruption and to mitigate the impact of that change in classification for colleges and for the continued success of the college sector in Scotland.
At our previous meeting, there was some discussion, and probably fair to say a bit of confusion, about what could or could not be done at the moment with these surpluses. I mean, some of the money was described as notional, it's asset estimates of value of assets, it's committed funds for some purpose or another. But there was another category there where there was free cash, in my understanding. I don't know what proportion of it all, free cash for the colleges to decide what to do and to deliver whatever they wanted to deliver. Is that the case? Is this money that's in this pot, is any of that available for the colleges at the moment to deploy in student services or courses or anything of that kind? Because we have heard about the cuts agenda and so on and so forth. But in my view, from what I've been reading here in the Auditor-General's report, there are substantial amounts of funds in these funds here. And can any of that be deployed to deliver service within the colleges as they currently stand?
The college's reserves at the moment are not subject to reclassification, so it's all as is at the moment. It's normal business, if you like. And colleges will take decisions based on what their own commitments are, what their forecast commitments are. Some colleges, I think, have loans and so on. So they will need to take careful account of that when deciding how and when they deploy those reserves. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning here, and it was something that was mentioned when I was at Dundee and Angus, is that colleges are instinctively entrepreneurial and have actually forged very important and agile partnerships with other funders, but also more likely other parties, particularly when they're looking at projects. And so colleges have sometimes money in their accounts which they're holding on account of a particular project and a particular partnership. So the important thing for them at the moment will be to take all that into account before deciding whether to dip into their assets for day-to-day running, and that's what colleges, I'm sure, are doing at the moment.
This question really is on the numbers issue that was mentioned by one or two of the members. The Auditor-General's report referred to the total numbers of students on an FTE basis being broadly the same, and members have expressed other views about a huge drop in numbers of colleges. When will we tidy that kind of process up so that we can actually monitor what's happening with people? And I think it was Andrew Scott that mentioned that sometimes there are multiple applications for a particular course, and presumably if only one of a multiple are successful, it might lead you to think that there's a huge drop, a bigger drop in the numbers of people attending college. So how do we square that clearly different view and perspective of this data, and when will we tidy it up so that we get a clearer picture of what's actually happening?
I think there's two aspects to this. One of them is to ensure that we compare like with like, and that was a point I made earlier on. We use full-time equivalents now because we know that that is a currency, if you like, to allow a comparison, a robust comparison and a transparent comparison about what is going on, what was going on, and what we anticipate happening in the future. So, for example, the targets that are set by the ministers for the Scottish Government for colleges are set in full-time equivalents, and those targets, the most recent set of targets have been exceeded by 3,000, I think. So colleges are doing a very good job in responding to that, but I think the important thing is that we do compare like with like. I think the other point that you're making here is about how we ensure that the processes, administrative and systems and policies that inform applications are as tightly focused and as streamlined as possible. And I think one of my colleagues mentioned earlier on the work that's being undertaken by Education Scotland on that front, not just to look at the processes that support applications, most importantly across a regional front now rather than individual college front, but also where they bump up across regions. So I know that Education Scotland, for example, are doing some work with Tayside and Fife, where you have students who are living in one region but might well end up applying to that region or the one that happens to be very close to their home. That has the potential to be quite difficult to handle administratively, but also to skew figures if we're not careful. I think the final point I would make about us making sure that we are helping to streamline and ensure that admission policies are helpful in the new landscape is IT, because clearly as new colleges are set up, mergers take place, we'll want to make sure that the IT capacity helps the administrative support for admissions processes and indeed for accessing data. And we're heavily dependent on the accuracy of data to do, as you say, to make sure that we tidy this up.
Okay, thanks. Leslie, can I just clarify, because I don't want to misinterpret anything that's been said. What you were saying to Willie Coffey about the way that the Umbrella Trust has been set up, did I take from what you said that the Scottish Funding Council set up the trust and appointed the trustees?
They are in the process of doing that. They have appointed the trustees, yes, and that is the Umbrella Trust, which covers the whole of Scotland.
So the trustees have been appointed by the Scottish Funding Council, and the trust has been established by the Scottish Funding Council?
That's my understanding.
Yes, the Funding Council identified the trustees, didn't appoint them.
With colleges who wanted to be part of the Umbrella Trust.
They had a say as well?
They did.
Right.
Yep.
And the Articles of Association were drawn up by the Scottish Funding Council in discussion with those colleges?
With trustees. And with taking appropriate legal advice.
And the trustees. So who established the Articles of Association then? Would it be the trustees legally? Would it be the trustees, or would it be the Scottish Funding Council and the colleges and the trustees together?
Again, I'm wanting to make sure that I'm not misleading you here, Convener. My understanding would be that it would be the trustees legally who would establish the Articles of Association, but obviously that follows a process that we've just described. My colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong. No, that's right.
So the colleges, and whether it's the umbrella organisation or the independent ones, none of the colleges would actually legally establish the Articles of Association. They would discuss, they would try to influence, but legally they wouldn't establish the Articles of Association.
Unless they were trustees.
Unless they were trustees, of course.
And I'm not in a position to say whether the trustees on the umbrella are college members or not. No.
But they wouldn't be, because that would then compromise their independence. Yes. So the colleges are not on the trusts, right? And the colleges don't establish the Articles of Association. That is done by the trustees.
Legally.
Legally, that's correct. And you will come back to me about whether at some point in the future the trustees could apply for the articles which the trustees established to be changed. And we're quite clear that legally the colleges and indeed the Funding Council actually have no say legally in the Articles of Association.
Legally.
That's right. Okay. Thank you for that. Just one final question. It comes back to a discussion earlier and where Andrew, I think, had made some comments. It may have been a discussion with Colin Beattie about what was happening down in England, and there were references to the private sector and private funding and so on. I think, Leslie, you had indicated that it was important for there to be accountability for the use of public funding when it came to colleges. Why is it important for there to be accountability for the use of funding for colleges but not for universities?
Higher education institutions have a different history and also have a different funding proportion of public money. So I think I mentioned earlier on, the ministers were particularly adamant about further education, taking a particular route there because of the 75% level of funding. The proportion of funding in higher education institutions is, I believe, significantly lower than that. I think it's more about a third. So it's just a different set of circumstances. They have a different constitutional and governance arrangement. They have a different history, and there's a different landscape.
Should the proportion of public funding for colleges decrease at some point in the future, it may well be that there will be further reflection about that need for democratic accountability and whether a different relationship should be established.
I was making was that higher education institutes are different beings and have a different kind of profile and a different history and constitution, and that's the reason why they're not comparable with further education. The fact is, ministers took the decision that they did on the basis of the level, the amount and the proportion of funding and their commitment to governance and accountability for the further education sector based on the Griggs report recommendations.
But colleges haven't been subject to this kind of accountability before. They weren't accountable to government ministers before, were they?
They weren't in the immediate past. No, they weren't. Previously, they've of course been very involved and accountable to local government, different arm of government.
Colleges have never been accountable to government ministers in this way before.
Not in the way that we're describing at the moment. It's a different set of circumstances because ONS has prompted a different set of conditions.
Well, it's not just because of ONS, is it? Because I thought that there were decisions that were taken about accountability to ministers, and there happens to be a separate issue about ONS.
Indeed, I mean, ministers were already engaged with the governance and accountability, you're absolutely right, with further education before ONS came in.
So we're kind of new territory because this is the first time that there's ever been accountability of colleges to government ministers.
We're in new territory, certainly.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Can I thank you, Leslie, and your colleagues for your contribution, and we look forward to getting the further information that you've said that you would supply. So thank you very much. We'll break for a minute or two, and we'll move into private session and then break for a minute or two just to allow changeover.